Okay, can you guys see the screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, so part two of our second part of this particular theory of design exercise on reconfiguring modernity. We are looking at the idea of vernacular and vernacular architecture and its various sort of meanderings, or its various what do you say, various sort of ideas that emerge from this idea of vernacular, and a little bit of a kind of historical understanding of uh, what happens when the term gets introduced and so on and so forth. Yeah. So today's day is called vernacular. Okay. In terms of the language, as everyone knows, vernacular is a language spoken in a particular area or by a particular group of people, especially one that is not the official or written language. Okay, so it is a language that stays out of the written. It's more to do with the way you are speaking, particularly in vernacular architecture. Is architecture characterized by the use of local materials and knowledge, usually without the supervision of professional architects? Vernacular architecture represents the majority of buildings and settlements created in pre-industrial societies and includes a wide variety of buildings, building traditions, and methods of construction. Vernacular buildings are typically simple and practical, uh, whether residential houses are built or other purposes. This is a definition. I have taken it from the internet. I have not conjectured it at all. But one thing is certain that this idea of vernacular lies in some way, in some association with the idea of what can be called traditional architecture and what can be called classical architecture. Vernacular is closer to the folk, okay, but in many ways, and we'll see some of the ideas that sort of transcend between between what becomes traditional and what actually gets classicized. Classical in the sense that it is refined. It is what do you say, Rohan? You were using an analogy in the morning today, that it is something which is practiced and refined through this idea of riyaz, and that is what classical music is. Similarly, classical architecture is also something which is refined. In terms of Western sort of ideas of classical architecture, they generally sort of look at the Greek or the Roman architecture as classical architecture. Okay, Jin.
Uh, okay, yeah. So, like today we're going to be looking also at where these terms have originated, or where these ideas have originated, and in the case of like of trying to explain what the vernacular is, because I think we have very often called anything vernacular which cannot be uh, classified as a style, because you've heard this very often, that this is either Gothic or Rococo or Byzantine. Okay, so anything that would not fit within this within these classifications of style is often termed as vernacular. Okay, and trying to explain where this term originates from, or what the meaning of vernacular is, I think we can go back to 1753 and the idea of the primitive hut. And this was an essay written by this priest called Marc Antoine Logier. Okay, and he's writing in a context when he's seeing kind of all this Baroque architecture around him. Okay, and this Baroque is a very kind of gild, like there's this gold gilding, it's heavily ornate, and he sees it as kind of a very of these kind of excesses, which are not is nothing more than kind of just decoration. So he and he says that is this, he's actually questioning it, and he's saying that both for the architect as well as a person kind of using a house or a building, he says that what does one really want? Okay, and these are quotes from his essay. And so this was an engraving which formed the cover page for the essay that he wrote. And if you see here, there is a child, okay, and then there's a woman who's pointing out to what looks like two kind of trunks of trees on either side. Then there's a horizontal piece, and then something again, another two kind of barks or branches that actually form like a pediment. And he says that what does man want when he wants a house? Okay, and he's saying it's just what he actually wants is the same thing as a primitive human would want, and that is a basic shelter. This shelter is something that should kind of cover him but not bury him. And he says that the kind of the basis of all architecture can be found in three elements, and he calls these three elements the capital, the entablature, the column, the entablature, and the pediment. And he says that that is all what makes a home. And so that's why then he goes on to say that pieces of wood raised perpendicularly give us the idea of columns. The horizontal pieces that are laid upon them afford us the idea of entablatures. And then this entablature ultimately holds up the pediment. He says that what is the basic function of a home? The basic function is that it should that you should be protected from the sun and rain, and one can that is all that one needs to live in a house like that. Other themes that this essay also kind of elaborates on are this idea of going back to nature, about space itself in some way, saying that what is this idea of like I was saying earlier also, because he's reacting to this kind of baroque opulence. He's saying that, is that really essential, or does man, this is like a basic how, or like the home or a shelter is a very basic need, and this is all that one requires.
Sorry,
Should we go
shall I go?
next? Yeah.
Okay. Carrying that same thought forward, we have seen we saw the exhibitions in the exhibitions on architecture, the 1925 exhibitions on the decorative arts. We saw the later one, 1938 exhibition that just happened before the war, if you remember. Another very important exhibition that happened a little later in the 60s, during the entire sort of movement of the 60s, was this exhibition called Architecture Without Architects. Yeah, it was by a Austrian American architect named Bernard Rudowski. I think the book is there in our library as well. Okay, I'm just going to read out this part. In 1964, the exhibition Architecture Without Architects was put on at the Museum of Modern Art in New York by Bernard Rudowski, accompanied by a book of the same title, including black and white photographs of vernacular buildings. And this is, by the way, this is also the first time the term is actually really used for architecture. The term vernacular architecture comes into public kind of discourse first time during this exhibition. It was for and this is a quote: "For want of a generic label, he says, we shall call it vernacular or anonymous, spontaneous, indigenous, rural, as the case may be." Okay, so in his definition, it is all these various kind of ways in which architecture is happening, which, by the way, is the large chunk of architecture across the world is categorized under this category of vernacular. However, the range of studies about vernacular architecture since the book publication suggests that his characterization was limiting and problematic. Quite often, vernacular architecture is not anonymous and designed in very intentional ways that are learned through generations of practice and based upon the availability of particular materials profoundly affected by climate. Yeah. What was the exhibition? So I'm just sharing some of the images of the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. Is this exhibition? As you can see, in a gallery space, he was able to bring examples of architectures that are happening across the world. Yeah, Rudowski also had an interesting kind of a history. He for many years was working in Brazil. He had traveled across the world and he had done an acute study of different kinds of architectures across the world. The book, by the way, also is called, I think, Architecture Without Architects, the architecture of non-pedigree kind of works. Yeah, that's what the title is. And here's the preface to the book. Yeah. I found this very interesting. I'm going to read the first para, first part, and second para, first part. Yeah. He says architectural history, as written and taught in Western world, has never been concerned with more than a few select cultures. Yeah. In terms of space, it comprises but a small part of the globe. Europe, stretches of Egypt and Anatolia, or little more than was known in the 2nd century AD. Moreover, the evolution of architecture is usually dealt with only in its late phases, skipping the first 50 centuries. Chroniclers present us with a full dress pageant of formal architecture, as arbitrary a way of introducing the art of building as, say, dating the birth of music with the advent of the symphony orchestra. Okay, so that's fundamentally the crisis under which this exhibition actually sets itself. Yeah, that we have not really we have narrowed our gaze of what architecture is to a very small part of globe and a very small section of the timeline of the history of architecture. And this exhibition was meant to expand both of these problems. Yeah. uh, yeah, I mean, besides, I'm in the middle of the para, besides architectural history, as we know, it is equally biased on the social plane. It amounts to little more than who's who of architects who commemorated power and wealth, an anthology of buildings of, by, and for the privileged, the houses of the true and the false gods, of merchant princes and princes of the blood, with never a word about the houses of lesser people. Okay, so that's another intention of the exhibition. Yeah. The second para, architecture without architect, attempts to break down our narrow concepts of the art of building by introducing the unfamiliar world of non-pedigreed architecture. It is so little known that we don't even have a name for it. For want of a generic label, we shall call it vernacular, which is what I had already mentioned. Unfortunately, our view of the total picture of anonymous architecture is distorted by a shortage of documents, visual and otherwise. Hey, Lakshmikant sir, Lakshmikant sir, एक मिनट, class चालू है. Yeah. Sorry, unfortunately, our view of the total picture of anonymous architecture is distorted by a shortage of documents and visual and otherwise. Whereas we are reasonably well informed about the artistic objectives and technical proficiency of painters who lived 30,000 years before our time. When archaeologists consider themselves lucky when they stumble over the vestiges of a town that goes back to a 3rd millennium BC only. Yeah, so this was basically the entire context within which the exhibition was framed. Yeah. Following this exhibition, another book that came in 1969, which also becomes a very important book to actually look at, is called House Form and Culture by Amos Rappaport. Unlike the first work, which only sort of brought these examples into the gallery space and into the kind of Western world, House Form and Culture tried to, or rather attempted to actually theorize the ways in which different kinds of house forms form relationships with the culture that they actually come from. Yeah, so it had a kind of a much more, I would say, broader approach at looking at how those house forms emerge. Yeah. Just reading out from the book. The book tries to propose a conceptual framework for looking at the great variety of house types and forms and forces that affect them. It attempts to bring some order to this complex field and thus create a better understanding of the form determinants of dwellings. Like, why do people build the way they build? Yeah, a very important question that in fact to a large extent was not asked in this entire kind of modern movement of wanting to create something new. So there is a careful sort of look at that historical aspect of architecture also. But it goes on to argue, and this is a very interesting observation I found in the book. It says that material, construction, and technology are best treated as modifying factors rather than form determinants, because they decide neither what is to be built nor its form. This is decided on other grounds, he said. They make possible the enclosure of a space organization decided upon for other reasons and possibly modify that organization. They facilitate and make possible or impossible certain decisions, but never decide or determine form. Okay, so this I found a very interesting sort of hypothesis that the book hints at, that the form actually emerges not from material construction and technology. That form actually has its roots in what he says culture, and his definition of culture include traditions, include the idea of the everyday, include religion, and include myths, for example. Yeah. But what it also did, like the earlier exhibition, is it was able to sort of bring several examples and actually categorize these examples. For example, the buildings to the left are all dwellings that are made with one material, whereas the buildings to the right are dwellings that are made with two materials. Okay, so on and so forth. He goes on to make his point. At the same time, he also says that the plan of the hut in Africa is very similar to the igloo. Okay, although both of them are made with two different materials. So he considers material not as a determining factor in form. Okay, uh, that leads us to another exhibition in 1986. Jin, go ahead.
Yeah. So we've seen like this timeline, and this is happening over like over like a decade. And then in India, we have this exhibition in 1986, which is called Vistar. Okay, and this is Charles Correa was one of the curators. Okay, there were a team of there was a large team who was responsible for different things within the exhibition. A lot of architects that were kind of that were working in India at that time. Their work was their projects were on display in this exhibition. So this exhibition was titled Vistar, the Architecture of India. Okay, and this is a small taken the small piece from Charles Correa's introduction that he has written on the in the catalog for the exhibition. And he says, this then has been the purpose of this exhibition, to make explicit these overlays and their relationships one to the other. For the architectural masterpieces from our past are not just wondrous pebbles, which we as savages have found on our seashore. On the contrary, each one is a crucial and decisive step in the successive vistars rather, that constitute our history. Okay. And there is a very definite way in which this exhibition is organized. Okay, and this exhibition also, you have to understand, is coming at a time when we are trying to find out that what, or rather trying to figure out what is the kind of what is Indian architecture. Considering that we've had a colonial past and even more kind of building traditions before that, and now post independence and much later after that, what is the Indian architecture? So if you see, this was how the exhibition was organized. There were these two big, or rather two main themes or kind of divisions, which was, one was called traditional and the other was called contemporary. And this traditional and contemporary, not just in terms of how like how the exhibition was conceptualized, it was also in the way the space or the exhibition space was laid out. And so under traditional, you had something which was titled Manusha, then there was the Mandala, Kundwapi, Islam, Manthana, and Colonial. And under contemporary, the three other themes were modernity, roots, and looking beyond. Okay. Now, if you see, this is a layout of the exhibition space, and from the entrance, you came first to this kind of foyer, which was titled Purusha, because that was it was about the mandala was there, and then then that kind of divided it onto two spaces. The left space was the traditional architecture space, and the right was the contemporary architecture space. Now, within this, what they also sought to do through this exhibition was they tried to look at the influences or themes that Indian architecture kind of drew from or kind of built on. Okay, yeah, Shirish, you want to go take this?
Yeah. No, I mean, I was quite intrigued that while the traditional sort of part included included the the category of Manusha and Mandala and Kundavapi. Okay, it was very comfortably able to to place the vernacular as a step or a step. From where many of the other kind of classical has emerged. Okay, I
Yeah.
mean that's the sense that I got when I went through the entire document, is that for Charles Correa, that distinction, that vernacular is something separate from the classical. He was attempting to actually blur that in many ways. Yeah,
Hmm.
and then he's also attempting in the idea of finding what is Indian. He's attempting to also blur between the idea of the classical and what we are looking forward. Okay, and hence he goes on to put many of the examples in his looking forward category, which are not necessarily only contemporary modern architectures. Yeah, so that's what
Yeah.
I found very interesting. I also as a part of the exhibition document, the he had also cataloged some of the ways in which we actually observe and study architecture. And I found that this idea of a typical hut uh, as a category to actually look at as architecture students, a very intriguing category, and very difficult to actually sort of absorb, because I know that across the Indian landscape, the typical hut is not necessarily like this. Okay, but what he's doing in the process is he's again typifying or creating a typology of a hut as this kind of architecture that comes from the people, very similar to what the first sort of drawing of the book that we were seeing in this lecture itself, like that this is the typical hut, this is what we need to also see while we are learning how to be architects. Yeah. uh, Sorry, Jin.
Yeah. So and then when Shirish and I were putting together this lecture, we said that okay, then how does one, or rather, how does one determine what the vernacular is, and or rather, what are the categories that we think that the vernacular falls with, or what are the themes that the vernacular engages with? And we said that the first one we thought, looking at the way people were writing about the vernacular, it was the way it was being discussed. We said that what if the vernacular is, actually a diagram, a cosmological diagram? And this kind of a little note from the Vistar exhibition, we took this little note from the exhibition, and it says that for architecture is not created in a vacuum. It is the compulsive expression of beliefs, implicit or explicit, central to our lives. When we look at the architectural heritage of India, we find an incredibly rich reservoir of mythic images and beliefs, all coexisting in an easy and natural pluralism. Each is like a transparent overlay, starting with the model of the cosmos right down to this century. And it is their continuing presence in our lives that creates the pluralistic society of India today. Okay, and I think that the key words to kind of take away from this paragraph is, one is, of course, images, myth and kind of beliefs. The second is pluralism. Okay, And if one, so like if you've known that, Shirish, can you go to the next slide? Okay, like the mandala is something that that has come up very often in conversations, and I'm sure you must have heard it as well. And the Vastu Purush mandala, okay, where you say that you put man, you place man within this large grid, and it kind of determines where the feet are, the head are, and spaces are then laid out on the basis of that. And these mandalas are are understood to be models of these of the cosmos, okay, in that sense. And they say, and not just and if we have to look at it, not just kind of sacred buildings, but even kind of maybe everyday buildings have been laid out in this kind of grid. And you have different, like you have a 64 square mandala or an 81 square mandala, okay. It's also, what they also go on to say is that the mandala is not actually a plan, okay, and what it actually represents is an energy field. Okay, and if you see this little note over there at the side, it says it. And as in the case of the black holes of outer space, at the dead center of the vortex is nothing, which is everything. It is both shunya and bindu, the world seed and the source of all energy. In all mandalas, at this center is located Brahman, the supreme principle. So saying that, okay, like, so they're also trying to we're trying to understand it through the belief system, or the Indian belief system, and saying that if it is this kind of since all kind of our religious buildings, in this case mainly the temples or the temple town, is laid out on this principle of the mandala, how does one kind of understand why this, like, what is the basis for to follow this plan? And if we have to look at some kind of architecture that um, is based on these diagrams, and there are a lot of mandalas. The Vastu Purush mandala is just one of them. If we have to look at these diagrams, Shirish, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay, you have to, if one has to see, a lot of structures can be understood as these based on these mandalas, like of course the stupa, for example, or the caves, primarily religious kind of structures. But there is the understanding of a diagram about how things are placed, why which kind of programs are placed in which part, how much of it is, like if you look at the stupa here on the left, okay, you'll see that at the center, so everything, it's like you circumambulate to kind of as a ritual. And in the center, so it's like a large a hemisphere, okay, which you can like, this is like, it's you see, there's nothing that you can do except kind of walk on this large platform. But on the top of it is this Harmika, which is what the top of the stupa is called. And it says that that is where it's drawing all the energy, and that is probably why, because if you remember what we just spoke a little earlier, the center is this kind of is the concentration of all that energy. Or even the Buddhist caves, also in some sense, are said to kind of be built on these cosmological diagrams. Yeah, Shirish, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've turned the slide.
No, okay. Oh, and like we were talking a little earlier about the temple, okay, or the temple town. And this is the Sri Rangam temple, okay. And if you see here the way the whole town is laid out, okay, it is this kind of concentric kind of everything is located within these rectangles, that eventually at the center of which is the temple, the rest of the town is laid out in this kind of very defined manner. So what happens between in each of these layers, or between each of these gates, so if you see on the right, there are all the gopurams, okay, which mark the entrances of each enclosure, okay. So the within the enclosure, things are laid out as would kind of as people would build, and they were allowed to build, of course, with guidelines on the basis of who could settle where, etc. But the gopurams, okay, mark each enclosure or the boundary of each enclosure, which which are kind of laid out on a very kind of defined axis, with which eventually kind of takes you to the center of this town, which is the temple. So you see that how the diagram of these mandalas are then very completely just superimposed, and towns have been built like that. Or if on the next slide, if we see the temples, okay, and temples also then are understood to be these like representative, and these are drawings which are trying to compare the human body and the energy fields within the human body to the spaces in a temple complex. Okay, so why the main deity would be at which place, and or or like why spaces have been laid out, because they're all kind of responding to this diagram, and this diagram over here is again in relation to the body. This of course, if you know of temples, okay, they were not always built in the way we build today, in the sense that you don't have elaborate drawings. There is always an understanding of what are these spaces supposed to be, or what are these why the deity is in its place, where the kind of how entrances are marked, why the use of an axis. And even much later, like the drawing on the right is when we're trying to understand the layout of these temples. We are understanding them also through these principles, in some sense, about, say, axis, how the use of light, or kind of shutting of light actually represents, or the what is heaven, what is hell. And these kind of this is how we're trying to understand this architecture, because we kind of believe that it is all deeply rooted in our traditional beliefs and myths. Yeah, Shirish will go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, now one is of course these kind of myths and beliefs, and the other is also geometry. And I think this is even the saying that even geometry makes this the mandala, because it is square. You can even take that, and these are examples. Like the first one is the Taj Mahal, the second one is Humayun's tomb, and the third is the Quwwatul Islam Mosque in Qutub Minar. And you see that how they, like, of course, Charbagh is always kind of understood to be the basis on which Islamic architecture of this kind of very large scale was always laid out. But he's saying that still there is the idea of how everything, like the square being the most stable form, how it can eventually, everything can be kind of reduced to that idea of the diagram. Okay. Yeah, Shirish, you go to the next slide.
Yeah.
The slide yet. Maybe it has.
Jin, I've already changed. Maybe it takes a while.
Yeah, it's take time. Yeah. Okay. Then also, like, the vernacular is in a lot of ways, because it's supposed to be this kind of very this architecture that is coming from a very particular place, where people are building very kind of very involved and very closely building with what is available in terms of resources, in terms of material. And so if you have to look at this kind of vernacular as this architecture that is coming from the resources that are available, um, we'll first look at the Bani hut is these kind of circular houses of mud with a thatch roof. Again, coming up from this very primitive idea of the hut, like which we in the that came from the exhibition. And next slide is also the this is a drawing. They're saying that, of course, because you're in kind of Rajasthan, you're using mud because of the kind of climate that you have. You need to buildings are the most kind of sustainable and very kind of adaptable to this the as well as to the culture. So if you see on the image that we saw earlier was just the hut, with this thatch roof, but not just cluster is formed. It depends on is this kind of cluster is governed by how people choose to the idea reflective of arts and crafts of
So, Jin, your voice
of
is
what we
breaking.
would
Sorry.
say very kind of religious. Was it from? Yeah. Sorry. Now.
Uh, okay, can you speak? Hi, Jin.
Me, Shirish?
I can hear you now.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying about the bunny hut, and the hut not the kind of house by itself, but also.
Sorry, Jin, we are losing you. Hello. Hi, Jin, are you there? Hi. Okay, can the others hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you, Shirish. I think
Okay,
we've just
just
lost her. So I think you can continue and then we can get back to this.
Yeah.
later.
Okay. So one of the things that the exhibition also did, and what we are also trying to sort of make an argument is that that while so while you have the idea of the diagram that is really sort of deriving the architecture, there is also the idea of material. There's the idea of material and the way in which we choose to settle. Okay, that is also deriving the form. Okay. That's fundamentally that what we were trying to argue, that the vernacular is also inscribed in the way we settle with each other. Yeah, it's whether it is in the pole houses of Ahmedabad, or whether it is here in this case in Jaisalmer. Okay, the idea of the house and the settling as a cluster, in many ways is resulting in the way we are able to create the architectures. Yeah. The surface treatments has everything to do with the kind of climate and with the kind of transparency that one is expecting. The for example, the jali in case of Jaisalmer is very different from the way the jali is imagined in case of Ahmedabad, where it is generally made in wood. Yeah. Some of the other ways where some of the other determinants that actually help in constructing the idea of the form in architecture. This here is another house where which is in areas where there's going to be flooding of certain degree, where the entire house form then gets lifted up, and we've seen this in many places, especially in Majuli where we were there. Uh, while the Satras chose to stay on ground in the context which gets flooded, you had the other villages around were choosing to actually build on stilts. Yeah, again, the Satra determined primarily with the idea, or the conceptual idea of some kind of a diagram, whereas the tribal houses, or the local houses, built on the idea of how climate and nature can be withheld. Some of the other sort of determinants which are there, which we'll talk a little later again in the end when we talk about the everyday rituals. Is the way in which people then choose to build as it is part of their everyday life. Yeah. So architecture in this kind of mode is not something that happens external to the lives of people. Yeah. It is part of their rituals, whether they are everyday or cyclical. It forms a part of that kind of cyclical process of life. And here we are seeing the way the bamboo bridges are constructed, when they are constructed, or the way certain buildings are built at certain points of times, as well as certain ways in which building traditions are then passed on from one generation to the other. Yeah. Okay. There is another sort of way in which the vernacular has been sort of what do you say, appropriated, and this is something which we are confronted in our modern times today. This is actually a house that was built by a German architect named Hermann Kallenbach. The house is called Kral, which means a barn in English, and the house is it's actually called the Satyagraha House in Johannesburg, which was built which was actually built or rather Gandhi sort of urged Herman to build a house to uh, in the Tolstoy farm. Yeah, but again, the house itself uses a hut as the kind of formal kind of device, but the method of construction is very European. Yeah. Uh, when Gandhi comes back in India and starts his entire movement of his Satyagraha movement, he makes this architecture the the kind of counter sort of symbol for what is happening against the kind of colonial power against the colonial power. He uses the idea of a hut, a fairly elaborate hut, I would say, but still a hut, to in fact argue that this is where India is, this is where India lives. Most of the people come from these kind of spaces. This is the Gandhi Ashram in Ahmedabad. This is the Sevagram Ashram in Wardha. Uh, you can see there are distinct kind of differences, but yet basically appropriating materials that are closely available and where architecture can be built with your own hands. I'm just showing you that what is happening a little bit around the entire Vardha ashram today is a lot of development that has come up, yeah, which are large scale kind of buildings to host Yatri Nivas and things like that. The ashram still retains its kind of simplicity to some degree. Yeah. Uh, that leads us to another architect uh, who we find is closely learning from the vernacular, and this is of course the works of Laurie Baker, uh, one of the very important sort of ways in which Baker is able to conceptualize his practice is working directly with people who are constructing on site, directly with on site. And I think in his case, of course, Baker still brings a certain degree of formality, but is acutely aware of the way the material and climate actually influence certain choices of design. But the formal choices are still very much in the hands of the architect when he's building these houses. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Jane.
Also this. Yeah. So this is a project. This is called the Hamlet, and this is Laurie Baker's own house. Okay. And if you see, this is in Kerala. Okay. And although he's not native to Kerala, he lived and worked for a very long period of his life, and continued to live here till his death. And he said that how does one build with respecting these kind of building traditions, but at the same time creating a new language, because this new language also was on the basis of the kind of spaces you would need. And he kind of lays a lot of importance on making homes affordable and kind of low cost. And That is why even the kind of institute called Costford also that continues building in this on the principles of Laurie Baker. Okay, looks at saying that why plaster is required, why can't we use brick, and also these bricks are built from the soil that is available around, of course, and but at the same time, like in this image, if you can see here, he's also kind of taking from these traditions in the type of roofs, in the type of fenestration details. So if you see the windows, the door, those kind of that the window in the front, they kind of all belong to traditional architecture, or building especially in wood. When if you see, you can see them in the palaces, you can see them in houses. Okay, and he chooses to bring these elements back in the building he's designing. He also lays a lot of emphasis on the craftsperson, and here it is the people building the buildings themselves. So saying that even though we may be architects and we're building homes, etc., it's eventually the people who are the ones who are making these homes. They are the actual craftspersons. So he said that how do we kind of also allow for a continuity in that sphere, and that is why he says that we should learn, they understand materials, and they understand materials and technology intuitively, and that is, and you always work with them, work with them together. Shirish, can you go to the next slide? He also treats these kind of buildings, and he always allows for them, of course. A lot of people can commissioned him to build homes. He looked very closely at who would be inhabiting the house, and what was the background, whether they were a retired couple, they had a family that was growing, and on the basis of that, he would also allow within his projects a space for incremental building. He said that like these are homes, and as per you may require more space, and in his own home, which is this the hamlet, he added some spaces as and when he required as well. Of course, the insides, if you see, are all, as much as kind of you have built-in furniture, you have which is using it's some parts use stone. All of it was this kind of exposed brick. Also things like, if you notice on the top where the bell is hanging, is a bell which is the at the entrance. Okay, some kind of little stone craft that he kind of did it himself. So he's saying that because it's the space of the home, and the home is can become very kind of personalized. You should personalize, because that is a space that you're inhabiting. And also his a lot of his kind of buildings, and since he built a lot of homes, a few kind of institutions, but a lot of homes, they all kind of made space for these ideas. Yeah, Shirish, can we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a project by another architect couple, and that's Vasant and Revati Kamath. Okay, and this project is called School for Mobile Creches. This is built in Delhi, in Simapuri. Okay, close to a slum, and this project was intended to be like a daycare and like a play school for the children, mainly of women who were working as either construction workers, or kind of whoever women could leave their children here in this creche and could go to work. And of course, since this building had to be low cost, okay, you try to keep it low cost by minimizing the use of plaster, etc. But even if you see in the building, the elements like the use of, so if you see the plan, first of all, like since you have to keep it very you have to be, it has to be cost effective. The plan does not have the plan is laid out as a grid. Okay, and all spaces are then organized as per the requirement. It's a very simple structure. There's only a part of it kind of continues to the first floor, but if you see the volumes within, um, Shirish, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a section of this building. which has a courtyard, which has spaces where the children can kind of play in the arches within the within, and then you have the dome. So it's kind of the temperature is kept at an optimum. Considering this is Delhi, and you wouldn't have, and you do see an extreme kind of climate. Can you go to the next slide, Shirish?
Yeah.
Okay, and so this is what the inside of this space looks like. Of course, it's a very old image. The space still continues to exist, and children kind of it still functions as yeah. Shirish, can we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
I don't know what has come next. First, okay, and these are some more images. If you see things like the water spout, there are a few details that have been kind of worked out in brick itself. Okay, the brick is kind of used since is the primary material. They were trying to kind of also innovate in terms of details using the same material. Have you moved ahead? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, this is another project. This is another project designed by the same architects. Okay, and this is the Lakshman Sagar resort in Rajasthan itself. Very kind of exclusive resort. If you see, it's all like because it is built in Rajasthan, it has to be in mud, and they kind of studied the kind of types of buildings or vernacular buildings, and this is, and they said that since it is building in the same region or in the one should build, of course, very building very intrinsically with the landscape. Okay, making use of trying to create spaces from there. It's also attempting in some ways to give you a glimpse of what these more kind of domestic dwellings are. So even though it may be a resort, if you see the next slide, okay, so you will see the use of the arches, the type and size of openings, the way the building is stepped back. It's all it doesn't look out of place within what we would kind of or rather the image that we have of architecture in Rajasthan, or the traditional architecture in Rajasthan. Also in terms of colors, it's the building doesn't try to stand out as a another kind of a new building within this landscape. It builds very close with the way buildings have always been built in Rajasthan. The interiors also on the next slide. Yeah, you'll see that they try to keep them as close to the way spaces in all these kind of spaces would be on the inside. The type of mud plaster, the use of few objects, the creation of niches, etc. Some, of course, modern amenities would be added into it. It's a resort after all. But even if you can see the roof, the ceiling over here, they even the material that is being used is the same as that would be used in buildings that were always being built in Rajasthan. Yeah, and can you go to the next slide, Shirish?
Yeah. And there's a fireplace.
Okay. Yes, exactly. There's a fireplace. You can even the kind of like details in terms of the cushions. Can you see the mirror work on the cushion covers? The pots, etc. Everything is supposed to remind you of what you are surrounded by, and saying that all this is true kind of Rajasthani architecture, and these are kind of building traditions. These are craft traditions, and everything is then put into this building. Yeah, Shirish, you want to do Hunarshala?
Yeah. Okay. So another very interesting experiment that happened and that continues to grow is Hunarshala. Hunarshala actually came up in the post kind of earthquake sort of works that were happening around Bhuj, and it got set up as in many ways a design and build lab that would actually help people out in reconstruction efforts post the earthquake. Yeah. Hunarashala now offers its knowledge and skills of building designs and settlement planning, including reconstruction, wastewater treatment systems, and infrastructure. Uh, it has actually sort of emerged from three themes, rather: how people are empowered to shape their own habitats, and they also train people to become more. Habitats should become more environmental friendly, sustainable, and disaster safe. Yeah, and they are closely sort of interested in artisanal knowledge and skills that can deliver high quality kind of services. Yeah, I mean, I've already explained this. The building itself is a site of demonstration of bringing together the crafts which are otherwise going to get obliterated with the changing of generations, and an ability to actually put together architecture using some of the crafts and some of the systems and methods that have continued over generations. Yeah, and this seems to be another sort of an argument to the way we are in fact in many ways appropriating some of the vernacular sort of ways in which architecture is created. Yeah. Of course, this cannot happen unless you have an acute understanding of what is the architecture in the vernacular and how it is constructed and by whom it is constructed. Yeah. Just to give you some of the sort of ways in which spaces. Notice that the spaces themselves are very modern. Yeah. They are using materials and techniques which are very, very vernacular. Yeah. That is the way in which a lot of architects are starting to sort of create using building materials and techniques from the vernacular. These are just some of the photographs of the building. Jin, if you want to add something, please feel free.
Yeah. No, Shirish, go ahead.
Okay. The other work which is fascinating, which is emerging from the idea of learning from the vernacular, is of course the work of DB Contractor. I don't know, some of you, if you guys attended. Was there an encounter that happened? Yeah, it was an encounter that happened where
Yes.
her movie was screened. Again,
Yeah.
of course, in case of DB Contractor, she's not formally trained as an architect, but was heavily influenced by architects and architecture. If I'm not wrong, her parents were were artists who were very actively involved in the Bauhaus movement. Yeah. So she comes to India, and she starts to practice much later after she has her family and all that. But this is the kind of architecture that then gets built. She's of course very much interested in building with local materials. Again, use of mud, use of bamboo are her primary concerns, and in many ways those are the ones that she believes can be the ways in which we can build sustainable architecture. Just another photograph of one of her buildings. The other extreme of this appropriation is demonstrated by this particular project. It's called Amaya. It's a high-end luxury kind of a what do you say? So you go over there and you live in these houses which are designed in natural landscapes with natural materials, and this is of course Bijoy Jain's project. And I found when I was researching about this project, I found some of these texts very interesting. I'll just quickly read. It says, for Amaya, Bijoy looked at the villages around Kasoli. It's in that region, studying the materials and techniques employed to make its oldest structures. The idea, he says, was to take a mountain typology that has existed for time immemorial and bring it up to speed. Yeah, it's not nostalgic representation of the past, by way of distilling it to fit into the now. Amaya's every element, from the dry stacked stone walls to its copper roofing, embodies the spirit of these mountains and people, and yet it is unlike anything that has been built before. For Bijoy, collaboration is a key, as well as the ethos of his studio. For Amaya, he put together a team that was creative mix of local and international artisans and architects. Yeah. The result was the creation of contemporary, eco-sensitive structures made from rich local materials that have a relationship with environment. So there's a guy from, I think from Italy, who builds copper roofs using the same hand tools and techniques that are used to craft roofs. Sorry, he's French. The walls were constructed with brick and local stone, but finished in lime plaster, an ancient technique kept alive by a Swiss artisan. Yeah, and he also collaborated with artisans from Malda, West Bengal, to create walls that develop their own unique patina when the local soil is mixed in lime. Okay, so here now we have a sort of confluence of techniques and methods that are in many ways sort of coming from vernacular traditions, but they get assimilated into this kind of high-end product of architecture. I find it like that. Okay, this brings us to the kind of contradictions. I mean, some of them are already reflective when we were presenting, but this brings us to some of the kind of conflicts and contradictions that we find in this idea of the vernacular and the ways in which we choose to actually define the vernacular itself. And we did this studio few years back, which the studio was actually, you guys may have probably seen the documentations as well. This is the Chakrata. We are calling it building stories. It's the idea of vernacular as everyday rituals, and this was one of the texts, Rohan, that we had put together in some way, sort of defining what the vernacular can also be. And I'm going to just
I think you're right.
Yeah, one of the main kind of thesis
on the study trip was that to really think about what the vernacular actually is, as against what it is pretending to be.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to read this out, and then we'll look at some of the works that we did, and we'll open for a discussion. The vernacular emerges from local languages which respond to the particularities of place, and emerges from the rhythms of everyday life. Yeah, I think this was what we had argued. Myth, with its narratives of celebration and fear, religious rituals and beliefs, are also embedded in these languages, which architecture can never completely capture. Also, the discourse around the idea of the vernacular tends to fix living traditions in an ossified eternal past. Yeah, to be able to understand vernacular architecture, its typology and its making, one needs to be able to play within oscillations of time. So what we were arguing is that while there is a house typology, which is documented, which is fairly sort of out there and clear, that this is not static. Yeah, that life actually happens in this, and this itself is also sort of moving with life. Yeah? I'll just quickly show you what the typology is particular to Chakrata, where you have this kind of restrained masonry, and then of course, but the way the architecture is shaped is determined by the rituals and by its uses. And some of the ways, these are some of the examples of photographs of buildings in Chakrata, and the entire documentation then hoped to capture some of these kind of everyday rituals and stories, and also the kind of cyclical rituals of festivals and festivals that sometimes are spanning over 2 decades and things like that. This one particular is just a story of how women wake up in the morning and chit chat, and where are all the spaces of meeting and gathering, and where do kids learn, like all this becomes part of that vernacular. And it's not only limited to the way construction is happening. Okay, this is another story, which is how honey is actually cultivated in this architecture. What are the processes that are involved, and what requires. So this little house, which is over here, okay, and its entire process of manufacturing and sort of creating honey is actually very closely related to the way this entire town is set up also. Yeah, so this was the way in which we were arguing the vernacular. This was a way in which we were creating a framework to actually look at the vernacular. Okay, I think that's the last slide. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Let's open.
I just like to kind of add that, it's a,
Yeah.
so I remember, I mean, just to let you guys know a little bit more about Chakrata, right? So we do, we do measure drawings, right? And we used to do measure drawings in the second year. You all also did in Almoda, but one of the terms that I was, because before this we were doing these small towns, Shire, Jinnanoy, whatever. We used to go to Lucknow or Allahabad and make measure drawings of buildings there. And these are like, kind of, I guess you could call them like, architect designed buildings, usually, sometimes more vernacular architecture, but really city stuff, institutions. Abhijit Ekbote used to teach us, and suddenly said that, I think we should go to Chakrata. And I was like very irritated, actually. I was like pissed off with that idea only, because I was like, yaar, wapas jaakar wahi drawings that I've seen ever since I was, like ever since I've been in architecture. This idea of the vernacular architecture, like itna sundar, itna pristine, itna pure, itna honest. ये सब terms हम use, इतना sustainable, ये सब use करते हैं ना जब when we are talking about vernacular architecture. And then the drawings are made, and the drawings, what they do, the drawings like deny all of contemporary life. Okay, and they make the buildings into these like iconic style है, बाप का superb detail है यहाँ वहाँ. And I felt at that point, I think, and I remember having this big argument with Abhijit and Shirish. Were you also there at that point?
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah. And I think, ye kya hai, ye nonsense, like this idea of the vernacular, if it has to really make any sense, is about like vernacular is of the people. ना लोग बोल रहे हैं वो vernacular होता है. और जब लोग बोलते हैं वो सिर्फ अपने प्योर शुद्ध भाषा में तो नहीं बोलते. They are speaking in a language that is taking terms from English and from Marathi and from, they're learning new terms. They are creating new words. Even now there's a vernacular, if you want to call it, that people use on WhatsApp, like LOL. I mean, I would say that's a new vernacular that is emerging. It's a language that is emerging out of people's everyday usage. It's not classical English language. It is a language of the people, and languages of the people are usually far more agile. They take on new things. And I felt like if you're going to be doing, I think I remember having this discussion as we were going there. One thing we as a group decided that if you're...
Sorry, Rohan, we lost you.
That you're not going to... Okay. One thing we decided to do is not fetishize ye object. Bole hum ki vernacular architecture, we have to talk as if it is alive, as if it is part of, it's as if it's an animal that belongs to the people. And when an animal belongs to the person, to a family, it is part of their economy. It's part of their social life. It is part of the rhythms of everyday life. So that's one of the reasons why we said that storytelling would be the perfect way for us to really think about vernacular. लोगों की कहानियां देखते हैं और spaces में कैसे play out होते हैं वो देखते हैं. Why do we act as a vernacular is some special architecture only? The vernacular is architecture's relationship with life. So that's why we started this entire thing. It was great fun to do, and I thought it was like I thought actually at that point, Shirish and Jain, that I thought we had done something new at that point, because I don't think we had redefined the imagination of the vernacular. I felt.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting also because of the way we were able to conceptualize the studio. Okay, so a little bit more context to Chakrata. Chakrata actually is very close to a major military setup, yeah, and heavy presence of the Indian military. Chakrata at that time, Abhijit's interest was to explore Chakrata because Chakrata was undergoing a kind of a regional development plan, which strangely the locals actually really wanted that development plan. Okay, because of the presence of the military, the development was actually stalled in that area. Okay, so you couldn't do certain kinds of things because of the strong presence of the military. Yeah, and politically, there was a development plan that was being prepared for that entire region, Jausar Bawar, which was choosing to keep Chakrata out of its ambit because of the presence of the military. Okay, so there was a lot of that tension. So while we thought that this is the romantic kind of vernacular place, town, village, it in fact was not. It was in many ways connected with national politics. Okay,
Yeah.
so very strong, and we realized that very strongly when we were actually there. The presence of the political presence and the angst about this whole thing was so strongly there. At the same time, what another interesting fact was that Chakrata is one of the few places, or rather Jaunsar Bawa region is one of the few places that practices what is called polyandry. Okay, which is this strange, not I'm calling it strange, sorry, but it's a
Yeah, I know.
system. It's a system where there is a woman marries all the brothers. Okay, so she bears children from different brothers. Okay, I mean, you can look up polyandry. It's fascinating as a system, and one of the few places where it is still practiced happens to be in Chakrata. It meant a very different kind of way in which land was structured, and how relationships were structured. And Rohan, we experienced it firsthand, literally, like what happens in that system, which is conflicting with this kind of modern idea of a nuclear family wanting to set up, but you can't, because you come from your land, and your sort of wealth is actually associated in the earlier system, and so on and so forth. So very fascinating to open that question of the vernacular, okay, as not only the question of the tectonic, but also the question of socio-political kind of life. Yeah. Okay, so let's open this now for discussion. Yeah. Ritik.
Yeah, hi. So, so the presentation started with that text from the primitive herd, right? Which stated that I don't remember exactly, but a man is willing to make himself a place which covers him and not buries him. So when we speak about the vernacular architecture in Indian context, like it kind of emerges from small settlements and it's different everywhere. Like those houses actually provide shelter to people. Uh, like the materials is from there itself. Uh, but
Yeah.
but what about cities? I mean, so we never find an essence of a particular place in cities.
Mm-hmm.
So a slum everywhere to me, like a slum in Mumbai is same as a slum in Delhi. So
Yeah.
what I thought that it kind of contradicts the statement from that thing. Is the man really willing that thing, or he's just accepting reality? So I was thinking that.
Okay.
Then there were lots of thoughts during the whole presentation in my mind. So so matlab, when we speak about the rich Indian architecture, why do we always speak about Mughal gardens, tombs, or the Rajput palaces, or the temple architecture from South India? I mean, I don't know how to put this up, but uh, are we losing out on the vernacular architecture of places? Like monuments were there, and they are always going to be there to tell the histories of the king.
Hmm.
But what about the histories of people? Like
Yeah.
so,
So that was Ritik. That was one of the attempts by Rudowski when he created the exhibition, which was called "Architecture Without Architects," was to bring that entire kind of area of architecture, which he called non-pedigreed architecture, yeah, to the forefront, okay, and put it in the MoMA in New York, which is the kind of center in many ways of modern art and architecture. Yeah, so that was the attempt. Okay, but we found that over a period of time there is a, I mean there is a certain way in which we are choosing to look at the vernacular also, which is still the kind of classical way of looking at things, you know. So it requires a different framework to look at, I feel. I mean, that's my response. Jin, go on, please go ahead.
No, I
I
think
understand the
Ritik,
urge. Yeah.
no, Ritik, I do understand that. I mean, I think it's a very important point that you're raising. One of the things for me, like, whenever we look at the idea of tradition, and I think it was really important to make a difference between the words traditional, vernacular, and classical. I think it's an important distinction. When we look at, because when you're thinking about the idea of the classical, you're looking at one that represents larger value systems of a society. They are classicized. So they, like Indian classical music, it is learned, it has a set of rules and regulations. There is a particular class of people that has the knowledge. Usually the upper castes often have that knowledge of these kinds of fancy traditional, fancy sort of abstract imaginations that are there. And that is what I guess you could call the classical traditions of most societies. On the other hand, there's the vernacular traditions. Vernacular traditions very often are seen as those that emerge purely from, far more, let's say, everyday aspects. Climate क्या है, ये क्या है, वो क्या है, लोगों का social structure क्या है. उनमें ऐसे नहीं लगता लोगों को कि value systems है. लगता है लोगों को कि value systems अपने बड़े-बड़े monuments में होते हैं और बाकी के लोग जो है ना वो ऐसे live करते हैं और अपने हाथों से अपने घर बनाते हैं. That is the loose, unfortunate binary that is very often existed. Now, when we are trying to write a history, and like you're saying, when India wanted to write its history, when we wanted to write a history of Indian architecture, we have to think about who was writing that history and what is the history that they chose to write. पहले तो Indian architecture to construct करना था. India तो था ही नहीं 1947 के पहले. If you think about it as a united nation, it was a set of many different states. Or it was imagined from Europe as one of their colonies. English thought of it as their colony, right? So they were also writing a history to collect that entire thing as their colony. When we became independent, we decided to write our history based on our colony. Even when Charles Correa is putting together Vistara, okay, he is also constructing an Indian history. Okay, he's constructing an Indian history by the examples that he chooses. Okay. But each of them is writing a history and choosing examples according to what nation they want to construct. So what the colonialists do when they write their history, they forget all the vernacular because that is anyway, everyday shit. They think architecture is only that is done by architects, value systems jisme hota hai. And then they act as if there is such a thing called Buddhist architecture, then something called Hindu architecture, something called Muslim architecture, and then naturally it's British architecture. So what they do is that they place their own monuments and that legacy in some way justifying them as the natural rulers of the new Indian nation. So that's the kind of history they write. It's a false history if you think about it. I mean, the idea, this narrative that you have Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, is only applicable to a very small part of the country actually, if at all. If you look at, let's say, South India, that story doesn't hold. If you look at Kashmir, that story doesn't hold. If you look at Assam, it doesn't hold. Even if you look at parts of Maharashtra, it doesn't hold. Yet, that is the story that we are told in all the damn history books, that is our tradition. Certain, like one Buddhist, one temple, Khajuraho, dikha diya. I mean, kahan se? Pehle to, one thing we have to be very clear about, that histories are written to construct ideas. Histories are not truth. And you're absolutely right in raising that point to say that, why is that the history we are writing? But the answer is we are writing that history because that is the history that was written for us by first the British, then the Indian nation that did the same thing. The Indian nation also said that, okay, abhi British ko ke baad hum Indian dal denge. So modern Indian architecture. So Nehru goes about creating this modernist sort of break with the past. So what Nehru is doing when he's asking Corbusier to come and build a building is he's not breaking with tradition. He's writing a new history for the nation. Understand? Each and every one of those buildings is writing a new history, making a nation through the invention of tradition. Okay. Now what happens in the 1980s, and that is, I think, an important junction, where now you have people like Charles Correa, people like B.V. Doshi, who suddenly are paying attention after the 1960s revival of the idea of the local. Okay, or all of this idea of the small is beautiful, these ideas of pattern language by Christoph Alexander. Yeah. All of these now are suddenly saying that, but in this big thing about the larger buildings, we are forgetting the fact that most of the people in the world live in architecture without architects. So what is the nature of that architecture? Who is building them? It's important for us. If we think that we're going to be part of the processes of changing the way that people live in the world, it's important for us to recognize that 99% of the world is living in buildings that are not designed by us. Yet, so then it becomes that question, how can we learn from them? And then So, I don't know whether Jin and Shirish mentioned this. Vistara, as an exhibition, was part of what was called the Festival of India.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't mention this, Ron. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
So in the 1980s, okay, that suddenly there's this idea कि इंडिया क्या है, सब पैनिक हो रहा है कि हम क्या है, समझ रहे हो ना, हम मॉडर्निस्ट तो है नहीं, तो अभी हमें इंडियन को रीडिफाइन करना पड़ेगा, कैसे करेंगे? तो इंडियन को रीडिफाइन करने के लिए एक इंडियन फेस्टिवल बनाते हैं जो goes around the world, okay? Dance, music, art, architecture, big exhibitions are held in France, in America, I don't know where else it went to. And Vistar is actually part of that exhibition, that large festival of India. So, and Korea, when he's putting together this, so he has to put together what is called Indian architecture. What does he do? He does one of the most strangest things I have ever seen.
Yeah.
What he does, he invents an Indian tradition based on Vastu Purush Mandal. That's what I think. Okay, because the Vastu Purush Mandal as a diagram is only valid for a very particular kind of Indian temple, nothing else. At the most, it's the city of Jaipur. Okay, which also I'm not certain about. But really, it is the Indian Hindu temple, okay, that is the Vastu Purush Mandal is relevant. And if you look at, I mean, most of the other cities have grown out of completely different forces. Maybe the Brahmin's house, if nothing else, I don't know. So then, what Korea does is, I think, is a kind of really strange sleight of hand, which I think is very problematic in my head. If I think about it from, let's say, a subaltern or a Dalit point of view, that he takes a highly Brahminical imagination of the Vastu Purush Mandal and makes it representative of all architecture in India. It is ridiculous. Okay, he makes it Banni Hut, okay, which is built by tribal women, to kind of all kinds of architecture are then framed within that idea of the Vastu Purush Mandal. So what is he doing? He's creating an icon, an imagination of tradition that collapses classical imagination, the temple, with vernacular imagination. He's acting as if both belong to the same tradition. They do not. They definitely do not. He invents the idea of Indian architecture. And this is what I was taught as I was a student. We continue to fall into this trap. You have many people who say this is not Indian and that is Indian, when actually the imagination of India that's there is actually, I'm sorry to say, Rajasthan and Ahmedabad. Because that is where
Delhi.
That zone.
That zone.
North Indian desert zone.
Northwestern zone, yeah.
Yeah. So what happens to all the other architectures that have grown? What happens to all the histories that have been written about architecture in the country? What happens to Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra? What happens to Satara, Sholapur? Do they have no history? What happens to Lucknow? Even the big cities, Allahabad. None of these architectures are even noted by most of the histories of architecture that have been written. And Janela can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, none of these architectures are even documented by histories of architecture in this country, only because they are not imagined as purely Indian. In that sense, they are not purely traditional. They are not purely. So this idea that to write a history, one needs to find the purely vernacular, untainted vernacular, जहाँ कोई सेल फोन नहीं होना चाहिए, प्लास्टिक बैग नहीं होना चाहिए, ची ये तो इम्प्योर हो गया, स्टील नहीं यूज कर सकते, वुड चाहिए, कार्विंग चाहिए, प्लास्टिक तो बिल्कुल होनी नहीं चाहिए. That kind of imagination is purely vernacular, and you find so many architects who then use that imagination to sell extremely rich products to very, very rich buyers. Bijoy Jain, Vasant and Revati Kamath, who make this idea of the vernacular itself into a commodity. Oh, look how cute mirror work. Oh, the tribal women must have done it. And then that becomes a commodity that is sold. So I think it's a very interesting category to really think about. And you're absolutely right in saying that there is a problem. There is a serious problem in the way that we have thought about our tradition. And for us to really rethink it is going to take some amount of work. And that is actually what we were thinking and hoping that the second year study trips at KRVI can do. Sorry, that was a long answer to your short question. Anyone else wants to kind of get into it?
I think a lot of questions that I had at the beginning were also cleared over here. And one of the examples that comes is recently I just saw Tenet, and a very So every time when you talk about India, the visualization of India is also not what it is right now, but more like some purane zamane ka song with these lot of people on the street and like there's but that's not how India is right now. And like Ritik also said right now that like some time ago that this vernacular architecture that we even talked about right now is you can like right here in living in Pune or Mumbai, you can't really find it anywhere in the cities, and even the villages are growing in the way where now you will see the concrete and steel grow, and the idea of vernacular because of the machines that have also come is reducing a lot. I mean, like you said, like even the resort that we saw had a heater, but that is just for showing that acha we used to use heaters initially, but now there are ACs and there is so many other things to control, but that is not what is shown as Indian architecture or visualized. Even
You know why, Avanti? I think that is because architects haven't been able to figure out how to work with vernacular architects. So the truth is that if you think about the slum, I would make an argument that says the slum is an urban vernacular. Okay, that's my argument. It's built by people, it's built by hands, it's built by using local techniques, it's built with ingenious solutions given the paucity of materials and resources that are at hand. So I would make an argument to say maybe the slum is an urban vernacular. And there are people who have begun to kind of think about that as well.
Yeah.
You tell me, what are the ways in which architects are currently, you guys are being trained to be able to think about intervening within that vernacular? What happens is this, I'll tell you the general thing, the way things work, okay? That the practice of architecture is born in a certain kind of economy. It belongs to a certain mode of production. एक client होगा जिसके पास बहुत पैसा होगा, उसके पास property होगा जो उसका होगा, land title clean होगा, ठीक है? वो एक आर्किटेक्ट को हायर करेगा. आर्किटेक्ट तो बेसिकली अगर डिजाइन करेगा, बाबा मैं तो ड्राइंग बनाऊंगा, मैं तुझे डिटेल सब बना के दूंगा, एकदम झक्कास. I'll make your plan, I'll make your elevation एकदम beautiful. Okay, that's what I'll do. I don't touch the materials, and that's all like, the contractor. So then I'll put together a tender, and then the tender, some contractor will come who will be like a professional contractor, done certain amount of work before. I will test him, and then he will give me a submission. Then I'll say, okay, you can build it. And I'll be like, okay, I will keep coming once a week or something like that. I'll take a look at your building and see whether it's all right. But the drawing, what I've given you, you must follow because, the drawing is the king. Now, that mode of making buildings itself is completely alien to a guy who's making a slum house. You don't have that kind of clarity of separation of forces. That particular machine of production is not our machine of production that we know. And the same goes for houses in villages. The same goes for houses, for so many things that are happening in our country. That are the way that we've structured the architectural profession is unable to even begin to understand how to participate in those processes. So if we really, so what we end up doing is this. We'll finish our kind of, we'll do, oh my God, all this lovely stuff is happening in the slums are such ingenious things. There's such wonderful things. So many amazing things are happening there, right? And oh, they're so beautiful. I find that's also a very interesting thing. Oh, they're so interesting, so beautiful. Oh, look at the blue tarpaulin, so gorgeous. You have that full kind of thing that's happening now. And then you make a fancy home for a really rich client. Okay. And on that you say, yeah, I was inspired by the slums. Yeah. I should put a beautiful blue like a tarpaulin so that your rich client also feels like, oh my God, I'm so progressive. I'm thinking about the slums, I'm so kind of happening. Okay. So, but it actually has really nothing to do with the slum. It is merely surface. It's not dealing with the truth of the vernacular. It's an image of the vernacular. And that is what Shirish's problem really is, even with the Bijoy Jain project, I think.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, my problem is not just the Bijoy Jain's project. Actually, Rohan does not even have the image of the vernacular. Sorry.
Okay.
It completely removes the vernacular, and it creates it creates this kind of elegance which the vernacular is not at all. Okay. Slapping the sort of surface onto a building still is bringing the vernacular slapped on, whereas Bijoy is elevating it to a place where I mean, it's consumption, right? It's like it's like eating a pastry which is a Theobroma pastry against someone else's pastry. Where I don't know. Sorry, those who love Theobroma, I like it, but like some things are just too elegant and too overpriced. Yeah. And I have, that is my problem with that project. Okay, where
So
if you look at if you look at the architecture, there's no architecture. Dabba hai सब कुछ डब्बा है, पर उसका जो पैकेजिंग और उसका सेलिंग जो है, the advertisement and the way it is packaged is so sort of elegant that you will pay. It costs 30,000 rupees a night to stay in one of those things. Okay, so yeah, so let's understand what is happening.
No, I think that is at one level, right? What I find amazing is that at one level, the vernacular becomes this idea of purity. And so I'm living in this sort of one with nature, which is very good for people from the upper classes to consume, because they don't need to live in. They have lived so much in luxury that for them living with nature is itself a kind of strange curiosity. So it becomes nice commodity for them. But what I find also interesting is the Gandhian imagination of the vernacular.
Yeah.
And let's see what the kids have to say about it. Anyone wants to kind of respond to that?
Somebody has written something in the chat. Akshit, bad network. Okay, fine. What about the others?
Ishita.
Hi. That I just have one observation. Like when you talk about the surfaces and how vernacular architecture. So at that time, when we look back to those times, we just understand why they built it and how they use those materials and elements to build it. But now it's just like merely decoration for us. And when we have to incorporate it in our projects, it becomes like, whoa, like I don't know how to put it, but it becomes like that's Purana and.
I think क्या होता है ना कि ये जो idea होता है ना कि vernacular में पहले तो kind of let us try and understand that let us not kind of completely diss the imagination of the vernacular. The architecture that emerges very often as vernacular architecture, because it's coming up with very limited resources, built by hand, very often is extremely rooted in its context. It's very closely connected with the economies that are generating it, with the communities that are generating it, especially also with the climate response. That is the truth. That is undisputable. That architectures that have emerged over many years have learned from that time and are making architectures that have a certain kind of quality of locality. That's one thing. Also, we can learn from that. As architects, we can learn from that. And it's important to know that it is important for us to learn from the fact that these architectures exist, and there's an incredible amount of historical knowledge, community knowledge that is deeply embedded in the typologies that are created, in the way that climate is used, in the way that verandas are made, in the scales that are made. Extraordinary stuff exists. So it's extremely beautiful. But let us not is my argument is a little different. But let us not imagine that the vernacular is pure, okay? Or that there is a certain truth within the vernacular. Let us not imagine that there's ideology within the vernacular. That the architecture itself is somehow representative of something deeper and more profound. It's not necessarily. Those are the desires that we have from people. We like our villagers to be cute villagers.
Yeah.
So we don't want them to progress because they can continue to be cute villagers so that we can have our iPhones.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Rohan, because I was having a conversation with Kaya in the morning. I was telling her that we are doing this presentation, and I asked her about. So they're doing a study on Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana rural. Okay, and they are going into villages and looking at what is the status of this. And their observation is that many places actually it's interesting because that idea of the state is that the state will provide resources for people to build. Okay, but we have to understand that the landscape of the rural is already now equipped with a certain kind of material availability.
Yeah.
Okay, it is no longer cheaper to build that house, it is in fact cheaper to build a house with brick and cement and this thing. Okay. So now what happens? Okay. So people, because the vernacular doesn't think of itself as pure also. Okay.
Yes.
So yeah. Okay. So they have most villages, people have bigger lands. Okay. You have a smaller home. People are building another home next to that home in RCC and brick. Okay. That home becomes the place where they go in the monsoons. Okay. This home is where they stay in the summers. Okay. Now what does that mean? Okay. So now you people for themselves are creating an understanding quite sensitively that what is really working and why you need that pakka ghar and what is the value of the kacha ghar. Kacha and pakka, this definition that we have created.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the vernacular or the people who from these places are in fact far more intelligent and sensitive to really knowing what those categories are and what it is that can work for them, and that's how vernacular has always been.
Yeah.
Okay? You're doing things so that they can work for you with the resources that are available. If resources are now coming from a certain way in which the economy is structured, okay, whether you call it the cement lobby, you call it anyone, okay, whether the sarpanch has a relationship with one cement, this thing and that thing, doesn't matter. I'm able to get cheaper materials to build a pakka, a more stronger wall. Okay, I'm going to use that, you know. So I find this entire thing very much still in the kind of what do you say, Orientalist kind of mode of looking at the vernacular, you know, where it is the way we are choosing to actually sort of place the vernacular in order to again appropriate from that vernacular. Imagine if the village is no longer the way it is, then what will you go and live in that village for, you know? So that's that's I feel is the.
I think it's also important. I think to follow up, Shirish, with what you're saying, is to really think about today's presentation in the context of last week's presentation.
Yeah.
Which is thinking about the idea of critical regionalism and the role of the vernacular.
Yeah.
I think what the vernacular really offers you is the idea of the local very, very strongly. And that is perpetually very often changing with seasons and economies and resources, like you're saying. Yeah. Okay. What critical regionalism does is that it learns from that, given the fact that critical regionalism very often is an architectural, kind of conventional architectural sort of I don't think you can call, I don't think, for example, you can call really Vasanta and Revati Kamath critical regionalists. I think what critical regionalism does is that it tries to mediate between larger forces and the local forces.
Yeah.
No? And I think Korea in many ways tries to do that. Where he's trying to in many ways reinterpret local, like things like the veranda from a colonial bungalow, for example, that then ends up becoming the balconies in Kanchenjunga. And there's a certain way in which he's kind of using that. So I think it's nice to kind of look at these two modes. One is slightly more kind of architectonic, while the other one is really deconstructing this imagination of architecture and tradition entirely. For me, what's important to do is actually to make sure in my head that one does not conflate these things. One does not conflate, the idea of truth. Like Gandhi, for me actually, when I'm thinking about Gandhi chose his costume very carefully.
Yeah.
He represented a sadhu. He wasn't a sadhu. He represented himself as a sadhu because it allowed him to kind of make an ideological statement concerning poverty, actually. Poverty as a good. So walk around barefoot. You know, there's a certain kind of Christian almost imagination of like being very sort of saint-like, and therefore do not partake in the pleasures of the world. And what happens with him is that he uses vernacular architecture to make that same costuming argument. So what he does actually, which is important, I think, for us to understand, that he creates a narrative for India that says that our truth lies within villages. Therefore, our truth lies within vernacular architecture. That then is actually where somebody like Korea and all are taking off from. I do think that there's an issue there, personally. But I understand that in the 1920s and 30s, when you're making that argument, I know why that argument is being made.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you have to understand that this is a political argument.
It's an argument of resistance. Yeah.
Yes, it is the making. It's architecture as part of a political resistance. You know, the language of architecture itself. It's an important thing to think about.
It's
I think
fascinating because Rohan, it is also happening at the time when the colonizers are in fact using architecture and taking the architectural kind of symbols and elements and placing it on colonial architecture.
Yeah.
Okay, so not that the colonizers are not doing it. Okay, so in that sense, the reaction is quite amazing. That you deny that kind of appropriation of architectural elements.
And one of the important things I'd like to state with respect to that, concerning what you're saying, is that I think Gandhi's ashram, both whether that's in the one that you showed, Shirish, in South Africa, as well as Sevagram as well, are some of the most important modernist buildings built in the last century. Okay, but they're never claimed as part of modern histories because they do not follow what we conventionally call modern architecture. And I think it's important to, if you trace that story, the invention of tradition and the invention of the vernacular as modern, which is actually what Gandhi's great invention was. And then you think about Ambedkar's resistance to that imagination, which really said that this is shit, because in the village lies death and horrificness as far as Dalit communities and women are concerned. But Gandhi's imagination continues to be that there's purity, there's truth there. So I think one has to think about the way that one invents tradition politically and how architecture plays a role in that invention. It's an important thing to constantly think about.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Quite an interesting thing. It's a really complicated question, really. And no easy answers here, you know. No easy answers at all.
Fun.
Anyone else wants to join in the conversation? Or is this like... Any examples? What did you guys think when you all were documenting Almoda, for example? What were these questions that were in your mind? What do you choose to document and what did you choose not to document? Ritik.
So it's
somebody else is saying something.
Yeah. Avanti is saying something. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we mainly just, even for our AD sites, we removed the concrete buildings. We looked at more intricate details of wood that a building had and marked those details. But I feel like what we are missing is there was this vernacular age, and then everyone started looking at what modernism is and how you have to become modern. And now that the age of the vernacular is kind of, or the using local materials is gone, now we're just trying to, like Shirish said, slapping the vernacular just to make it look nice. And I think that is something that is happening in Almora as well. Like, even if there were buildings with concrete, there were little things like just like following, each building was of a different color probably. So just to fit in the context, the building was of concrete, but there was a green color on top of it. So there were these.
I think what would be interesting is actually, this presumption that we have that says that the vernacular age is over. This is one important thing actually. Is always a question for me. I keep wondering about that, because when you're driving, let's say in Bombay, and you look at all the different crafts people that are working with metal or working with wood, I keep thinking that these are all crafts very much there in the city today, like today, And I wonder why we as architects are not able to tap into them as crafts people. Why do we think of them as industries? And I was wondering, just like an open question actually, I've always wondered about that. Is it that we have presumed that many sorts of activities no longer exist when actually they are there? I don't know actually.
And the other Avanti, it's interesting that you raise this. The other thing is that isn't the modern project a universal project? Yeah. I mean, right. So what stops the vernacular from the modern imagination? But we have not created the imagination of the modern in the village. Actually, I mean that's
we don't have an idea.
We don't have that.
We don't know what modernity means in the village.
in the village.
Problem,
Yeah,
know? Because if modernity we've equated with a style, we've never thought what modernity is actually is about freedom, equality, and justice. If you use modernity as about freedom, equality, and justice, and then look at what architecture can do for it, then our idea of what is modern will change.
Yeah.
That's what I
This
think.
is, but it's fascinating what you're saying about Almora. I personally feel that it's exciting that people are slapping facades because I think that they still have the freedom to express their building, whatever it may, or hide the building on the inside, you know, and I think that that's a very sort of modern tendency to clothe rather, you know. The ashram in Wardha is any other plan, okay, but it can be clothed either in the thatch roof and things like that, or it can be clothed in something else, and their architecture becomes a language that speaks, something that communicates. Yeah, and I find Indian cities are filled with signs of communication. Yeah, Lucknow was super exciting, not only because of the architecture that we documented, but because of all the buildings that were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with their facades, which were incredibly decorative and hilarious at the same time. Yeah. Airplanes hanging on top of buildings and stuck on facades with tanks and guns and the army, and everything became part of your facade of architecture as a way of expressing or talking, rather communicating. So, okay. All right, shall we stop? This by the way, for us, this is a continuous conversation. It reoccurs every time when we are thinking about the study trip. Generally around that time, the debate grows and then it turns into something, and then it comes back again into some way of the studio or drawing, and we are searching. So feel free to respond to this debate at any point of time, and feel free to comment on the chat.
I think you'll have to write